A Glance in the Mirror. Chapter 37. Reaching Out. The 1977 session was finally completed. Terry's first year in teaching turned out to be more successful than he imagined. The skills brought from industry stood him in good stead. Experiences were far more necessary than educational techniques. If there were occasions when students' rowdiness became a problem, his late position in industry as a manager of London's leading colour printers gave him credence and an abundance of relevant work situations to offer as talking points. The college was inspected by Ofsted in 1984, the staff given a month in which to prepare for a months-long inspection. Being not long out of teacher training, he had all the notes for lesson plans. He need not have bothered, for sheets of instructions were passed down the chain of command. All lessons had to have a teaching plan to conform to the latest psychological learning pattern. So many minutes for the introduction, 3 to 5 main points, lecture subject, summing up, and a return to the key points. Every teacher's programme was checked by the head of department. All classes had to be of a certain size. All rooms fully utilised. The equipment on the department's inventory list were recorded as proof of necessity. In other words, there had to be proof that the college was efficient and operating within budget. Frankly, it wasn't, and never would be. Classes over a certain size had to have additional staff and the extra teacher identified. All heads of departments and lecturers had certain student contact hours spent before the chalkboard. These hours were allocated according to seniority. Classes over a certain size were allocated extra staff, and that was recorded on the teacher's programme. Extra staff for large classes rarely turned up. Rooms were not used to their full potential, and when the inspectors attending classes, a specific number of students had to be there to make the staffing, equipment and space viable. If the class lacked students, extra bodies were co-opted in, and similarly the classroom, furniture, equipment, tools and machinery identified as deemed necessary. The lesson of the day could conform to the syllabus and link to the previous and the one to follow. Lecture room assistants should be present and found necessary by inclusion. All handouts prepared, issued and talked through to make sure all points were covered. These planned lessons, aims, objects and the methods were an essential part of teachers' stock in trade and considered essential for correct course preparation. In reality, they were rarely used, others taken up only if by chance, if the inspectors were present. The inspection was a face-saver, and not necessarily taken seriously, except as something to be suffered for a limited period. Lecturers 3 years before reaching retirement age were generously found higher grade work to increase their salary. This improved their average monthly salary. It was this figure that was necessary to work out the pension. It's perfectly obvious lecturers who had been in further education for a lifetime, towards the end of their teaching life, are neither in full possession of the latest industrial techniques, nor as fit to teach as they had been when young. The newspaper industry controlled how the rest of the industry operated. The newspaper owners were very rich men who sometimes ran a business, not necessarily reliant upon always making a working profit. There was, and still is, a certain status enjoyed by newspaper owners as key political informers, as movers and shakers of government policy. In many instances the owners were knighted and feted by society. Their families also enjoyed an inflated position. They had an in to Westminster and to power, and this power, wielded by newspaper owners, manipulated and controlled the printing industry. Their profits retained the status quo over the life of the industry. stifled innovation, and pandered to union demands. Their actions and social attitudes affected all trades of the industry, even to those that had nothing to do with the letterpress industry. In many instances, they were family-run businesses handed down to continue the attachments and political preferences ever after. They were insidious, and in some ways above the law. The workers knew all about these attachments. They worked on the traits of greed and avarice. The letterpress workers, especially the typesetters, machine minders and their assistants, became the highest paid, enjoyed the shortest hours, and took the longest holidays. In total, they had the best industrial conditions of any worker, and some had a second job that made the disparity even worse. They went to the annual wage reviews energetically, ever ready to extract the maximum for the minimum. Both sides knew each other well and played upon each other's weaknesses. The union leaders wanted to keep their positions of power and influence, and the bosses wanted to keep the industrial wheels turning. And gradually conditions improved, but not fast enough to hold off overseas challenges. Old machines kept working. Working conditions endured. Outdated systems were maintained. Eventually, the whole lot tumbled down simply because, as always, technology ruled what was inevitable before new materials, presses and systems came on stream. You can only maintain old equipment and work out-of-date techniques for a limited period. Before spare parts could not be obtained, new techniques bypassed, and competitors undermined those who were backward. The first to profit from the change was the provincial newspapers, 40 of which were owned by Eddy Shah in the Midlands, outside Fleet Street's influence. The new information technology implemented using a more flexible, less rigid set of union rules. New materials and web offset presses using the lithographic principle allowed changes to the page makeup system, and alterations became quicker and cheaper than the cumbersome letterpress process. The owners of the national newspapers were not slow to recognize the benefits gained by moving to another print base, where it was then possible to throw out old arrangements and agreements, allowing members of the Electricians' Union to work the presses. In Britain in the late 70s, there were 10 major print companies, 4 of which controlled outside the country. There was a number of mergers which still didn't improve print relations between management and the unions. Women were not apprenticed or trained in any craft within a printing works. They did so-called unskilled work as feeders of the printing presses, and found work in the print finishing shops, making up work, packaging and box making. And even in the finishing room, they didn't touch the guillotines or form cutters. It wasn't until the 1980s that girls were trained as planners in film makeup. This barrier operated throughout the country, including further education colleges and trade unions. In Northern Ireland, neither men nor women who were Catholics were employed in any position whatsoever. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party elected into office after the winter of discontent, when James Callaghan Labour government had been in power. There had been a desperate monetary crisis in 1976 and very high unemployment. Wage controls and spending cuts were the line taken by the Labour Party to effect control. It was obvious that trade union power had to be reduced. The new government spoke of planning for the future and controlling the unions. De-industrialisation was a fact, and news of further closures a daily event. This didn't take into account the EIM, which was set up in 1979, which Britain refused to join. This was not what the Chancellor, Geoffrey Howe, wished, as he was a confirmed pro-European. The strength of the printing unions were very noticeable at the London College of Printing. There was every reason why it should be. It argued rightly that technical institutes tended to be backward. in a technological sense. Their main task was to train and teach fundamentals. It was rare for such institutions to develop industrial advances. It certainly was so in the printing industry. Newspaper workers were the most militant unionists. They were in a position of power in the college, which dictated where the resources lay. The letterpress and the gravure departments in the college saw what was happening in industry, that they too might be faced with fewer students if they persisted in teaching out-of-date techniques and theory. They had installed darkrooms and light benches to contact and plan film. By enrolling unemployed workers who were taught film makeup and darkroom procedures. This they did successfully, instigating new printing courses, planning courses for apprentices and trainees, altering their teaching programs. All higher and further education colleges have within their structures a hierarchy. Each of the specialisms catered for have a validity of their own. Schools, departments and sections are the complex structure of educational establishments. They operated in hierarchical structure. Their position is not permanent but fluctuates as industry and commerce changes. Unfortunately, they are always slightly behind the time, taking longer to alter their internal arrangements. In this instance, both letterpress and gravure departments survive by being flexible. There are three factors: research, publications, and government-led educational preferences decides on the direction college funds are distributed. The sums influenced by an ever-changing landscape of wars, elections, personalities, etc. Fads, biased thinking, and personal preferences play their part too. Terry's mother-in-law, Rita, played a part in the direction the family took. She advised on the children's piano playing and listened to their reading. She thought Terry should take on an outside interest. Rita made this off-the-cuff statement, not really thinking the consequences through. She was keen to see that individuals did not become hidebound and inward-looking, so invited discussion by speaking out, even if unsolicited. Her criticisms were also meant to stimulate discussion and possibly dissent. Terry didn't know why she pressed so hard to make others react. She purposely would say something provoking to her friend Beryl just to see what her reaction would be. It wasn't her most attractive trait. There were times when Terry believed this side of her character was passed on to her daughter. Her influence had the desired effect, and that September Terry took up badminton as an evening class, having never played before. The class was about 20 strong, populated mostly by women. This is quite normal for all evening classes. Women are the more socially minded, preferring to do things in company. Some of the class had played before, but not the majority. In fact, it didn't take long to get in the swing of the game, and in no time at all, Terry found he enjoyed the experience. The small group of men stayed together for many years, gradually improving whilst taking an interest in the professional game. They all went to the All-England competition at Wembley and took on extra tuition. 4 stayed together for 8 years. Terry became so clean he attended a British Badminton Association course and became a qualified coach. Golf and dinghy sailing were other interests which caught his imagination. Terry could see that his attention to the children and other family matters lessened. And he was prepared for the out-of-home interest he found unsettling and disruptive. Terry wondered if the interest shown by Rita suggested an out-of-home experience was to test out his steadfastness and give her another psychological case to follow up. Sally had an interest too, and during and after school she played lacrosse, which continued right up to when they were first married, until being pregnant with Simon. Later, but only for a short while, took it up again. She was an aggressive player, wanting to be where the play was, there to win. When her friends at a Keep Fit class asked her to join a netball club, this took over, and this became a weekly event. The youngest family member in the pushchair and the rest walking alongside watching play from the sidelines. The highlight attended the finals at the end of the season. Then Sally took up Red Cross work, attending their weekly meetings. This she found interesting because it was closely allied to her work and medical experience. And whilst making one or two friends, being a medical secretary by training, she went back to work part-time until Rebecca was found a position at kindergarten at the age of 4. She then took up a full-time vacancy in the audio pool at Northwick Park Hospital, dealing with arthritic and rheumatic conditions. Terry and Sally attended the hospital dances and social events to back out their fundraising for various charities and societies. Sally made many friends with patients and members of staff, and these friendships within the department involved many lunchtime get-togethers which spilled over, affecting afternoons, continuing on into the evening, upsetting the department's head. Office staff in hospitals and other large institutions are mainly women, many of whom are job-sharing or on part-time contracts. A high percentage of these are unmarried, single mothers, separated or divorced, the complex social mix. These groups can have a great effect upon each other, affect each other's happiness, stability and social relationships. Those that are dissatisfied, disaffected and unhappy seek entertainment and spice up their lives by involving others, which can have a knock-on effect, causing instability. Men working together talk about cars, work, DIY, sport, gardening and television. They do not belittle their wives, however bad their relationship. Women talk about family and the home, social community life, holidays, television and children. These are generalizations, but show that it is more likely that women in certain groups discuss between themselves their personal relationships, sometimes in a disparaging way.